The Stars Beckon. Chapter 3. They'd taken full advantage of the director's 48-hour pass to start integrating the new additions into the team, but it quickly became apparent it wasn't going to be an easy task. The astronaut community was a tight-knit group, and even if you hadn't worked with an individual, you generally knew them by reputation. Everyone was there because they wanted to be there, and each of them had worked their tail off to rise to the top. Only the best of the best made it, and a more highly trained and motivated group of men and women you would be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. But the newcomers, with the possible exception of Eli, had been drafted into the mission, and none of them, again, other than the Israeli Ghost, had any sort of training whatsoever for space ops, which meant starting with the very basics and slowly working their way up. Will and the mission support teams drilled them relentlessly, and it was a rare night indeed when the crew didn't collapse into bed utterly exhausted. They did have some points in their favor, however. They were both highly intelligent women, young, in decent physical condition, and while neither of them had been bitten by the space bug before now, they had both found motivations of their own to keep them going, even if so far they hadn't felt comfortable enough to share them with the rest of the crew. Trust was always hard, and considering where they had come from, it was even harder for them than most. Much to his own surprise, Will saw them meeting the challenges with grim determination, and well before he would have thought they'd be ready, he found himself in total agreement when the director announced they'd be launching to examine the beacon in orbit over Earth. "No matter how many times I look upon her, I still find myself in awe at her beauty," Kurt said reverently, as they rowed out to the launch pad where Magellan waited for them. Khadija shook her head. "Does your wife know you're in love with another woman?" she asked him, trying not to show her nervousness. "She is very understanding," Muller replied, his gaze still on the sleek-looking ship. "I cannot wait to get my hands on that beacon," Sujin said to no one in particular. "Just think what it could teach us. All this time it was right there over our heads, and we never knew." "I'm more interested in what it can tell us about the people who put it there," Will replied. "Don't forget it's only the first of many, and when we finally meet up with them, I'd prefer not to walk into the situation blind." The transport bus pulled to a stop at the base of the gantry, and one by one the crew made their way into the open cage elevator. Magellan didn't stand as tall as the old Saturn rockets, but it was still a long ride up to the top. Fontana couldn't help but notice that Therese was purposely not looking down, though she had herself under control. Eli, on the other hand, leaned casually against the railing, as nonchalant as if he were waiting for a cab. In just a few minutes, they arrived at the top, stepping into the waiting ship and taking their designated stations as the support team closed and secured the hatch behind them. Nekesa slipped on her headset and contacted the tower, beginning the checklist, as the ground crew cleared and secured the immediate area. Almost all the systems were fully automated, which simplified the countdown immensely, and unlike the old days, they were dressed in their coveralls instead of the bulky spacesuits. If they had to abort during takeoff, the entire capsule would separate, sparing them the need for the uncomfortable protective gear. Will ran down the checklist in tandem with his pilot as Kurt hovered over his precious engines. Magellan was a dual-drive design. While they would by using the hyperdrive systems once they achieved orbit, takeoff was handled by the fusion engine. None of the scientists were entirely sure what would happen if the hyperdrive was engaged while still on the ground, but they were all in agreement it came under the heading of very bad things. The minutes ticked by quickly until Will turned his head and looked back at the crew. "Final mark, 0.60 seconds to ignition," he told them, as the announcements came fast and furious. Mission control reports gantry is clear. A fusion reactor is hot, power levels are steady. Gantry has retracted, 0.30 seconds to ignition. I show good seal on environmental controls. Capcom reads 5x5. 0.10 seconds, Prifley has green light. 0.5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition! A roar of sound filled the cabin as the ship slowly rose on a pillar of flame. Their cushioned acceleration couches welcomed them as the G-forces slammed into their chests, adding 6 times their body weight in as many seconds. Their breathing exercises kept them focused and conscious as the ship rose into the sky, the procedures they drilled over running on automatic as the vibrations grew more pronounced. Magellan clawed her way into the stratosphere, and as the crew watched on the monitors, the view went from light blue to navy to royal purple, and finally into black. "Throttle back," Will ordered. "Prepare for orbital insertion." The sounds of the engines began to subside as the ship rotated and pivoted on its axes as deftly as a dancer. "On the ball," Nikasa reported. "Course is steady." "Board is green," Kurt informed them as their captain nodded in acknowledgement. "Shut down the fusion system and power up the hyperdrive," he ordered, before calling back to the rest of the crew. "Keep your bags handy," he said with a chuckle. "The first time always feels a little weird." Eli only smiled in return, while Therese and Khadijah shared a glance before hastily digging out their sick bag containers. "Fusion shut down," Kurt confirmed. "Hyperdrive is online, energy levels at 85%. Ready for translation." "Copy," Will acknowledged. "Stand by for translation in 3, 2, 1. Translate." In the blink of an eye, to the observers on the ground, Magellan disappeared from sight. There were still aspects about the technology that weren't completely understood. According to the science, one moment they were in normal space, and a moment later they were in hyperspace. However, there was a measurable difference between those two moments, and no one had yet determined where they were for that brief instant. The majority opinion was in that time frame Magellan and her crew didn't exist anywhere, and while that was the kind of thing that gave existentialists screaming fits, the system worked flawlessly. The human body, on the other hand, wasn't wired for non-existence, not of the temporary variety, at least. And when they rematerialized in hyperspace, the two women immediately pressed their sick bags to their faces, only to blink in surprise when their stomachs immediately settled back down. "That wasn't so bad," Therese said with a wary smile. "In fact..." "Medical emergency!" Graham suddenly shouted. "Negative function on all of Eli's biometrics. He's gone flatline!" The crew turned in shock to stare at the Israeli, who lay limp in his couch, his eyes wide open and staring at nothing. McClellan clawed his way of the harness, grabbing the emergency kit and rushing to his side. "No pulse!" he said frantically, digging through the kit and pulling out a large sealed hypodermic, tearing the bag open with his teeth. "Get his chest exposed!" Will and Nikasa started yanking at his jumpsuit, pulling his shirt up as the astrobiologist prepared to plunge the adrenaline needle into his heart, when suddenly Eli took a huge breath in, blinking several times in surprise. The crew froze, staring at him in disbelief as he took a second breath. "That was inconvenient," he said calmly, more to himself than anyone else. "Okay, what the hell just happened?" Khadijah demanded, looking like she'd just seen an evil spirit. "I don't know," Graham said in confusion, as he looked at the hypodermic still in his hand before putting it down. He backed up to his station, double-checking the readouts before shaking his head. "He's fine, according to the biometrics." His head swept back and forth between Eli and his displays, as if he was convinced at least one of them had to be wrong. Will loomed over the tactical specialist, who was in the process of tucking his shirt back in. "I don't suppose you have an explanation, Eli?" The Israeli gave what looked like an embarrassed shrug. "I'm afraid not all my parts were designed by Mother Nature," he admitted. "Apparently the translation disagrees with something." Nikasa pinched her nose, a pained expression on her face. "Do you mean to tell me you are going to die every time we translate?" She shook her head in exasperation as she glared at him. "Don't get me wrong, it's a terrific party trick and all, but there might be a situation where we actually need you alive." "I'm sure it's something simple," he said, shrugging again. "A minor adjustment." "A minor adjustment," Graham repeated, deadpan. "I don't suppose you have a ghost repair manual on hand, because speaking as the closest thing this crew has to a doctor, I wouldn't know where to begin," he exclaimed, throwing up his hands. Eli sighed and reached into sealed pocket on his sleeve, plucking out a flash drive. "I was hoping it wouldn't be necessary," he said unhappily. "My superiors really don't like that information getting around." He offered it to the astrobiologist, who took it from his hand as if it was made from weapons-grade plutonium. "If it makes you feel any better, Doctor," Eli said gently, "it might not be a problem with my organic systems. If it's one of my implants, then Kurt might be the better choice." He smiled at the engineer, who looked at him with curiosity. Will leaned in and spoke in low, clear tones. "Eli, let me make one thing perfectly clear. While you are aboard this ship, you do not keep secrets from me. You do not keep secrets from my crew. I don't care what your superiors want or don't want. While you are under my command, you will keep me fully apprised. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Captain," he said affably. "I told them it was a bad decision, but security. You understand?" "National security ends at the ionosphere, Eli," Will growled, before taking a deep breath and looking at the others. "That goes for the rest of you. A crew has to depend on each other, and we cannot afford to keep things to ourselves." "Understood," Therese said softly, while Khadijah simply nodded her head in agreement. He took another deep breath before looking back at Graham. "Can I safely assume he's going to be all right?" McClellan just shrugged. "As near as I can tell, his readouts are textbook. It's almost as if he went offline for a moment." "Then I suspect it may be an implant," Kurt piped up. "I would need to review the schematics to be certain, but that sounds like more of a synthetic issue than an organic one." "I want both of you to check him out before we head for the beacon," Will ordered. "I'm not taking any chances." "Copy that," Graham replied, handing the drive over to Kurt. "It may take some time to review all of this." "Time we have," Will told them. "Besides, it will give us a chance to double-check our systems and run a few training simulations." He turned to the navigator. "Nikisa, go ahead and get them started. I'll need to report this to Mission Control." Eli held up his hand. "Captain, while I recognize the need, my superiors will not. Discussing my situation over a comlink would cause problems, encrypted or no. However, if you include the word golem in your message, they will brief them on the ground themselves." He shrugged once more. "We knew the need to read Mission Control in might arise. That code phrase will do the trick." Will sighed and nodded. "I understand. All right, I'll get on it. The rest of you, let's start prepping for the beacon." He headed back to his station, shaking his head. This was a complication he did not need, and something told him it would not be the last.